everyone, my name is Princess Cinderella, and I decided to come back because I just had a pleasure reading to you last time. Today, I'm going to be telling you one of my favorite stories. It's called My Perfect Wedding. My dreams were coming true at last. With the help of my mice friends, I managed to race down the stairs just in time to try on the glass slipper the Grand Duke had brought. It proved that I was the right girl the prince had met and fallen in love with at the royal ball. Now, me and the prince were going to be married, and our brand new life together would soon begin. But first, there was a wedding to plan, and I didn't have the faintest idea of where to begin. Prudence, who ran the castle household for the king, was happy to take charge. She sat with me and read off a long list of things that need to be done for the wedding. "Excuse me," I said when Prudence paused for a moment, "but couldn't the prince and I just have a simple wedding?" Prudence frowned. "Cinderella? Now that you are going to be a princess, you need to start thinking like one. This should be the grandest wedding the kingdom has ever seen." Later on, the royal dressmaker arrived with several wedding gowns. The first gown I tried on was covered with bows and sashes and had a huge skirt. "The guests will mistake me for a present," I cried. "You look just like a princess," Prudence said. But I thought the dress was too fussy. "Do you think you could design something plainer?" I asked. "Plain and princess do not go together," Prudence said. The next day, Prudence and I visited the royal florist. He presented us with a bouquet of roses, which was so big it looked more like a bush. "Do you have something a bit smaller?" I asked. "It's perfect," Prudence said. "You just have to know how to carry it." She grabbed the flowers and a bee flew out. Bzz, bzz. Prudence screamed and the bee stung her. Then she screamed even louder. That afternoon, the mice found me, all by myself in the garden. "Where's Bossy Lady?" asked Gus. "Poor Prudence," I replied. "She's got quite a nasty bee sting. The royal physician says she has to stay in bed for the rest of the day." "But what about the wedding plans?" Jacques asked. "I'll have to take care of them myself," I declared. "Look at the size of this list. What do you think I should do first?" "Who's a-comin', Cinderella?" wondered Jacques. "The guest list." "Good idea, Jacques. We'll see. Well, of course, all of you are invited," I replied. "And my fairy godmother, too." I wish she was here right now. As fast as I made my wish, the fairy godmother appeared. "I just love weddings," the fairy godmother said, and I'm sure everything you've picked out is wonderful." I admitted I hadn't even started planning. "When is the wedding, dear?" asked the fairy godmother. Gus counted on his fingers. "Tomorrow," he announced. "Oh my goodness, child," cried the fairy godmother. "We'd better go get started." "Lots to do," Jacques added. He and Gus showed Prudence's list to fairy godmother. "We'll plan an absolutely magical wedding for you, dear," the fairy godmother gushed. "Now let's begin with the dress." She waved her wand, and I was instantly adorned in an elegant white gown. But the fairy godmother had forgotten something. "It's beautiful," I said, "but don't you think it needs a veil?" The fairy godmother wasn't listening, though. She had already moved on to the next item. Invitations, she declared. In the blink of an eye, thousands of lovely cards and stacks appeared around the room. Now, shall we prepare the feast to make the cake? The fairy godmother asked. I changed back into my blue dress and followed the fairy godmother into the royal kitchen. Meanwhile, the three of my mice friends lifted some scissors and cut out a small piece of fabric from underneath my wedding gown. And they threaded needles, pulled out a tiny box of pearls, and began to make a veil. The rest of the mice took a stack of cards to deliver. They didn't get very far before their plans were spoiled by Pom Pom, the castle cat. Phew! Close a call! Jacques cried as he and Gus raced to the kitchen where I was with the fairy godmother. And now for the best part, the fairy godmother exclaimed. With one giant sweep of her wand, she created the biggest, fanciest cake I'd ever seen. What do you think? The fairy godmother asked. Prudence will love it, I said, trying to hide my disappointment. And speaking of Prudence, I should really go see how she's feeling. Poor child, the fairy godmother said after I had left. I think all these wedding plans are too much for her. Jacques and Gus tugged at fairy godmother's sleeve. Cinderella, like smaller things, Jacques told her. Gus pointed proudly to himself. Like mice. At once the fairy godmother understood why I hadn't been thrilled. The fairy godmother went to my room a little later. I'm afraid I may have gotten a bit carried away, my dear, she confessed. Now tell me, what would the wedding of your dreams be like? After listening to me, the fairy godmother began to perform her magic. With a wave of her wand, the veil was finished. Then the invitations were sent to a smaller group of people. Now let's cut that cake down to size, the fairy godmother said with a twinkle in her eye. As we walked into the kitchen, I turned to the mice. Thank you, my little friends, I said gratefully. Anything for you, Cinderella, Jacques said. Bibbidi-bobbidi-boo, the fairy godmother cried as she pointed at the cake. It shrank and shrank until it was the size of a normal wedding cake. The next day, I got ready for my wedding. I wore a simple white gown, veil, and gloves. I carried a bouquet of garden roses that the mice had gathered for me. It was just as I had dreamed. But as the king was about to escort me down the aisle, I looked down and gave a little cry of surprise. I wasn't wearing any shoes. What was I to do? I looked down at the mice and then again down at my feet. The fairy godmother followed my gaze. Good heavens, child, she exclaimed. You can't get married in your bare feet. She waved her wand and suddenly I was wearing glass slippers. After the ceremony, there was a joyful party. It wasn't the kingdom's grandest celebration, but it was the most special. Even Prudence was pleased. How did you ever manage all of this? The prince asked me. I smiled and said, with friends by your side, anything is possible. The end. Thank you for listening to My Perfect Wedding. I'll see you next time.